over to you.
Perfect. Thanks very much. It is my first presentation here, and it's a funny thing that I feel like no matter how many times you speak, the first time you speak somewhere new, I feel like I'm back in honours defending my thesis. And apologies I couldn't be there with everyone today. I'm over in Adelaide, which is where Flinders University is. So to begin, I would like to acknowledge that since I am joining from somewhere else, I'd like to pay my respects to the Kaurna people, which is where I'm presenting from today and where this work has been done. So paying my respects to their elders, past and present, and very fortunate to be able to live on these lands. So yes, Flinders University, in case you haven't heard from it, we're in Adelaide, South Australia. I always tell people we're the one that's not merging, in case you've been following what's been happening over here in South Australia. The topic, we say topic here at Flinders, so sorry, subject unit might be your language, is Mathematics 1A. It's the standard first year maths subject that you do. So it's filled with engineers, computing students, our education students, science, and a relatively small number of sort of maths only students. So we have enrollment here in our first semester of somewhere around 300, and it has been growing a little bit over time. So that number is creeping up. One of the challenges we have is that we're quite spread out now. We keep adding campuses. We now have 3 campuses just within Adelaide itself. We also have lots of students who join remotely. We've even had students studying with us from the Northern Territory this year. And it means that it's really challenging to try to give a consistent experience to all of those students. So broad range of backgrounds, broad range of locations, different modes of joining. So some people are face-to-face, some people are online. And even between those campuses, we don't have the same schedule. Some students are doing 3-hour blocks and that's all they do each week, 1 3-hour block. Some people have the more standard small tutorial type class. So it's a bit of a challenge trying to make things consistent. Of course, we're probably all thinking about artificial intelligence. I just wanted to give a bit of context on what we do here at Flinders. This is the type of scale that we have for our assessment. It means that for every assessment task, we have to tell students which of these 6 bands that the task is in. It's very similar to the sort of traffic light thing that I think a lot of places are talking about. The one thing I wanted to highlight is that the policy at Flinders is that unless you invigilate a piece of assessment, you can't put things in the no artificial intelligence band, that red one there on the left. So it means that we're sort of acknowledging that as soon as something's not observed, students are probably going to use artificial intelligence, and it's up to us to actually say how they should use it.
What we see, what you're sharing, is different from what's on the screen in the room, because I can see it on a different screen.
I'm not sure. Everyone in the room, I feel like I can see my slide on the screen. It's got the artificial intelligence scale. Is that coming up for everyone there?
I'm online, and online we don't.
Yeah, we can't see that.
All we see we are the acknowledgement of country. That's where we still are.
I can see the current slides, and I'm online.
This is a fantastic presentation. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why that's doing that, because it seems to be showing in the room and a bit inconsistent online. I'm not sure.
Maybe if you can put the PDF and then we just change slides when you seem to be changing slides.
Maybe what I can do is I'll just attach that in the chat so you can grab that. Apologies, everyone. Let me just put this in there so everyone can have their own copy. Here was me thinking that everything was going great for an online presentation.
It does. It's interesting.
And it's just fortunate that in the room we happen to have a Teams login that is not been paused. I mean, I have a suspicion that half the group has got a paused, glitch or something. But in the room,
it's a pause thing.
I also don't know if I can actually attach this. So, look, maybe just in the interest of time, should I just press on and I'll try to keep talking through and make sure I'm saying things out loud.
Yes, that's a good idea, Hayden. Keep going.
Apologies for the people online who aren't seeing things. I'll do my best. So this is a bit of a timeline of where we've gone with this Mathematics 1A. So if you go back 6 or more years ago, it was kind of basic in the assessment. There was some online automatic marked assessment that worked 40% of your grade. So that was the sort of Maple, TA, Mobius type stuff. And a final written exam that was worth 60%. So not much variation in the sort of skills that were being assessed there. About 5 years ago, there were some modifications made. So some fortnightly written quizzes were introduced. So they were worth 20%. The automatic assessment was worth 20%, and there was still then a final written exam worth 60%. And I know there was a bit of discussion around those weekly quizzes yesterday as well. From 2024, we made a little bit of adjustment then where the final exam weighting came down. And this was a university-wide thing where they wanted to see final exams not be worth so much. So those fortnightly written quizzes bumped up to 40%, automatic assessment worth 20%, final written exam worth 40%. I'd just say about this, even though there was now a bit more variation, it did mean that it's still kind of assessing the same things like that. So not a huge amount of variation in what we're assessing. So it led us to sort of think, how can we broaden what we're having a look at here? A few other things that were on our mind. Obviously, I've mentioned that we have growing online cohorts, and doing a final written exam with an online cohort just kind of was getting a bit farcical, if I could put it that way. We were in the final situation we ended up with, we didn't have online proctoring. So it meant that if you decided to enroll online, you got a PDF, you did it at home and you sent your answers in. And if you did it on campus, you got invigilated. And it meant there was a real inequality between those two groups, because you have to assume those people at home are probably not following the same rules that the people being invigilated were. And even though we can't demonstrate that, the grade distribution was probably suggesting that's what was happening. As I mentioned, lots of different campuses, and we even have limitations on how much we can invigilate on various campuses. So there's a bit of a challenge there. Mentioned that there's probably a limitation in what skills we're actually assessing. And the final one is kind of the big one. And I suspect a lot of people get this thing where someone from, say, engineering knocks on your door and says, what are you doing in that first year maths? I've got all these second and third year engineers and they don't know anything. And we kind of sit down and go, well, we're teaching them the things that we think you want, but clearly there's some breakdown there. So these were all the things that were kind of on my mind. So we this year sat down and basically ripped the whole subject apart. And it's such a refreshing thing to be able to do, because I often find that when you tinker around with a subject, you end up kind of writing the same thing again. So every now and then blowing everything up is a really refreshing thing to do. To help guide that, I came up with these 7 things here, trying to think to myself, these are the things that I think you need to be a mathematician. I know everyone's probably got their own version of this. Every curriculum has their own version of this, but it meant that at least we had a list where we thought we can point to these things as being important. So we want to try to see people introduced to these if they're going to do Mathematics 1A. If it's called Mathematics 1A, it should be an introduction to mathematics somehow as well, not just the calculus type stuff. So we had a bit of an introduction to each of these concepts throughout each module, and then also an introduction to some Indigenous perspectives scattered throughout. It meant that we had this new topic structure where, as you suspect, we've got 12 weeks in our semester, so we broke it up into 12 modules. Those modules had online videos. We tried to keep these short, as we all kind of aim to do. And there was also some activities embedded throughout. So different sort of things like embedded Desmos graphs, different Desmos activities if you've used that sort of thing, some H5P activities like that, trying to get people a little bit engaged and thinking as they went through the videos rather than just sitting there with it on in the background. I once had a student who said to me, I really struggled with this area in the assessment because when you were talking about it in the lectures, I'd walk to the fridge to get some food, so I didn't actually see what you were doing. I thought that was a striking example to me of how students were actually looking at videos online. So we're aiming to try to make it a little bit more engaging. At the start of each of these modules, there was also what we called a big problem. It was meant to be a real world example of something that you couldn't currently solve, but by the end of going through the material, you would be able to come up with an answer to. So really inspired by lots of engineering and science applications. We tried to keep people aware of what they were learning as well by having explicit learning outcomes for each module, and that came in handy a lot later. I'll tell you about that hopefully when I can get to this oral exam bit. We also had discussions for each module, and just for some context, over the whole semester we had 980 posts on those discussion boards. Thinking that there's 300 students, maybe that doesn't sound a lot, it's 3 per student, but I felt like it was a huge jump up from no discussion each week. So mindful of time, I want to get into the assessment structure that we finally landed on. So we had a video presentation that was worth 10%, a report worth 30%, weekly quizzes 40%, and this oral exam thing worth the final 20%. I'm going to try and step through those because I want to give the context around all of these because I think it kind of explains what the oral exam was then left to achieve at the end of semester. So the video presentation was a really short video, 2 to 3 minutes. The idea was that you just had to explain the relevance of calculus to your degree. The point being that we have so many students who can't come into these sorts of subjects, say, this is pointless, I'm only doing it because it's on my study plan. We're actually trying to get them to stop and reflect on why you actually might be doing this. And to try to spread some of that awareness, this was peer marked. So each student not only made their own video, but then had to assess 2 other videos. So they kind of got a bit of inspiration around what others were doing. We're hoping too that this actually gave people a bit of practice speaking about maths, thinking about an oral examination coming up later. And it was a bit inspired by the big problems for each module. So people weren't just left completely to make it up. It was kind of encouraged that you should come up with something similar to motivate why maths was important to your area. The next assessment item was a report. We only wanted about 3 to 4 pages in total. You could chuck as much as you want into some appendices. We set a problem, and this was one of the most challenging things to do. It kept me up for days. And I even fiddled with the actual problem the morning before I planned to release it. The challenge was that I didn't want to just set a routine problem. I actually wanted to simulate what I've felt like whenever I've worked with collaborators and they've tried to explain their science or their engineering to me and get me to model it. And apologies to any engineers listening, I always find it's very challenging. We speak different languages. So the report problem description was very deliberately unclear. It had some missing information and it had some superfluous information. And it meant that the challenge of the assessment was actually then seeking that clarification. So for example, there was a forum post where people would ask questions like, hey, it says this thing is circular. Does it mean a whole circle? Does it mean part of a circle? So the task was built around, this is the way you're actually going to encounter using maths in your degree. It's never going to be neat. It's never going to be complete. And you're going to have to do some work to figure that out. The rubric to mark this was really weighted towards trying to separate people who were passing, who were doing the satisfactory level of work, and people who are really going beyond that and showing some creative thinking. It was a big problem that we've had in the topic that people would get very high marks, and we saw some presentations about this yesterday too, very high marks for kind of doing what was maybe a basic level of understanding. As I mentioned, this was not invigilated, so people were allowed to use some artificial intelligence for brainstorming and reviewing. The final thing, those weekly quizzes, maybe slightly controversial weekly quizzes. We ran these during the classes that we had. It was either written or online, depending on which mode you were in. The idea behind the weekly quizzes was to actually cover that base understanding that you would expect someone to be able to do. So you were allowed to use notes during this, again, trying to reflect a real world approach that you could look something up in a textbook. We didn't allow calculators, but I'm still really on the fence about that. I'm more and more each day just thinking maybe we should just allow calculators, even though there are challenges with that. It's a funny thing with weekly quizzes because I always assume that students are going to hate them, that these are going to be stress points. And so many people in the broader university tell us these are the things they want us to get rid of because it's piling up too much assessment on students. And then every conversation I've had with a student ends up being, if I didn't have these weekly quizzes, I wouldn't have kept on track. So they're the one thing that I want to keep. So I feel like I'm still a little bit mixed in my perspective of these. Here's the thing, though, that we really want. We ended then with an oral exam. The reason I wanted to talk about the other stuff is to say that the oral exam then had the freedom not to reassess all the things that we'd done before. So we ran this during our exam periods. We just had 10 minutes per student. The idea was to understand, or to get an insight into their conceptual understanding. So we've already seen that you can take a derivative, but do you know what that actually means? Can you use it? Can you describe why we did things the way we did? It was really helpful then having the module-based learning outcomes, because then we could really easily generate exactly the sort of things we wanted to ask students. Essentially, we wanted to get them to explain those sorts of learning outcomes. We had notes permitted, and there was a great variation in how people use that, but you couldn't use artificial intelligence. To give people an idea, we released a bunch of sample questions based on the first module so that they could get a taste of what sort of things to expect. To do the marking of that, we had, I've put 4 categories there, and I'm a terrible mathematician because it was 3 categories. Whether it was based on your understanding of the concepts, the applications and limitations you could discuss, and your mathematical language and communication. And each of these was just marked out of 4. So whether you were advanced, intermediate, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, or missing, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of these this sort of grade scheme was inspired by some of the rubric and grading stuff that's happened from members of this group before, and some of the building thinking classrooms thing. The idea, just trying to make a human understandable scale. I don't want to go on a huge tangent around grading schemes, but sometimes I sit down and say, could I actually describe the difference between a credit and a distinction? And I tend to prefer these more descriptive grading schemes, and also meant that it was easy to do the grading as we were talking to the students. As I said, the questions from the oral exam were just based on those module learning outcomes. To help us with the grading, what we did was write questions for each of the modules and break them up into categories, whether we thought these were satisfactory type questions, advanced type questions, or in between. And it meant that when we were grading people, the grading was around, can you answer questions in each of these categories? So if you were mostly answering satisfactory questions but couldn't answer the intermediate questions consistently, you got a satisfactory grade, and so on like that. And it's kind of similar to how some other oral exams around the place have run. Just to give you a taste, I've just done some sample questions here. So a satisfactory question might be, describe what the derivative of a function represents. I'd expect someone who completes Mathematics 1A to be able to say that. Versus an intermediate type question would be, describe the intermediate value theorem and any assumptions that you need. Complete coincidence that it's the intermediate value theorem as an intermediate type question there. The nice thing, though, was that even though we had these starting questions, we could then follow up questions as we went, so dig deeper into the student's understanding. If they said something that wasn't quite clear, we could say, could you clarify that part, or why did you say this thing? Around the logistics, we actually ran this on Microsoft Teams. Everything was recorded. Students had to have their cameras and microphones on for it, and you might think that was a pressure point, but that worked almost perfectly. Almost everyone had the camera ready to go, and the few that didn't, we could just shuffle around and make it work. We have Canvas as our LMS, so we just set up a whole batch of appointments, and students selected what time they wanted to do their exam, so it didn't clash with their other commitments. There was one academic assessing in each session, but we actually had 2 parallel sessions overall. To make sure that that was done consistently, we of course had the rubrics and all the questions broken up, but we also discussed things and monitored grade distributions to make sure that they were looking similar. So we had 70 sessions available all up. Each session was 60 minutes, and we would let up to 5 students book into a session. So it actually meant that we had a bit of wiggle room. There were more slots available than there were students. I might rethink that in future, but the idea was we didn't want students to miss a time that they really wanted. So students joined the main room. We did the oral exams in a breakout room so that people couldn't hear each other and there was some privacy. It was a 10-minute discussion. All the marks were entered and finalized within that 10 minutes. And I'd say often you didn't actually need that whole time. You got a pretty good sense of where someone was, usually about halfway through. So some positives that I think we got from this. The bookings and the teams did work really well. Fewer than 5 issues, I reckon, all resolved pretty quickly. I'm sure someone's going to ask a question about, couldn't AI be simulating these people? I think we're getting close to doing that, but I don't think we're quite there yet. I'm sure this is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on though, and it might not always work this way. I think the whole process was quicker. I do not think I could have marked all of those exams, if that's what we were looking at, in the same amount of time. So it certainly was a time saving, and I feel a lot mentally healthier having conversations with people than marking a bunch of exams. It meant that every cohort, every location got the same sort of experience. And I think we actually could dig a bit deeper into the students' responses. A written exam is a one-way conversation, but as I said, we could follow up. We could dig into things. And if someone sounded like they kind of knew what they were talking about, but had just misspoke, we could ask a clarifying question, and sometimes they would realize and adjust. It was relatively easy to moderate results. As I said, we only had 2 examiners, so not as challenging, but even still, it was possible to do that. And overall, I think the grade distribution we've ended up with is a lot more accurate than what we were getting before. Previously in the topic, we had a real U sort of horse-shaped distribution. Everyone either got a high distinction or kind of failed with a scattering in the middle. This semester we've flipped it upside down. So we're getting more of that clumping in the credit distinction band. A few issues. Not all students actually ended up booking an oral exam. It wasn't a hurdle task, but it was 20% of their grade. Some booked and then just never showed up. So we actually had 296 students in total. 261 of them actually booked an oral exam, and 255 so far have actually completed that, with a couple of sick students still to go. We probably found that more students than we expected went into that satisfactory category. Might have to rethink some of the questions and some of our grading, because I did expect it to spread out more than that. But we often found that students seemed unsatisfactory, and we would keep prodding them until they maybe corrected themselves and probably pushed them into that satisfactory category. Maybe I should have predicted that students really lacked organized notes. I'm stuck. Maybe I'm a dinosaur. When I studied and I would write everything down, we had everything from students with no notes at all to students who had not even bothered to take the notes out of their backpack ready for their oral exam. So you might need to give some guidance around that. There was some anxiety. Some students were visibly and reported feeling nervous, but I always think it's a funny thing that this stands out in an oral exam only because we actually are there to talk to them, and we could actually then calm them down a little bit, versus being in an exam hall where there's nothing you can do and you don't see the anxiety in your own students. Some students did take a long time to answer as well, and we had to sort of nudge them, saying, look, the 10 minutes is coming up to an end. You probably should say whatever you can now. So almost at the end, some changes that I'm thinking about. I want to try to actually help some of the students with their communication practice. We do try to encourage this at the moment, but I'm going to try and make it a bit more explicit. But it's a real challenge because I don't want to train them to do an oral exam. And I think sometimes when we train people to do assessment, we kind of undermine the assessment itself. I want to try to better train them to communicate, and then that's going to be reflected in their oral exam. I'll try and skip over some of the other assessment, but I did find some issues with the understanding of how to use artificial intelligence. So my claim here is that I actually think oral exams can work really well for what I'm calling a medium-sized topic of 300 people. I think it would extend to larger subjects. You just need to add in more examiners. I think I've got a much better picture of student ability than I ever would have got by just doing yet another written exam. But I think it's also really highlighted some gaps in the students that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, and hopefully some future improvements can address these gaps. So if we've got any time, I'm really happy for any questions.